Okay, I'm sorry to tear you away from lunch and the wonderful posters, but we've got an excellent panel discussion now. So this panel 2 is taking a whole systems approach. It's trying to address climate change, which we haven't heard very much about yet, and biodiversity, which I don't think we've heard anything about this morning. And we're trying to achieve both or all of environmental, economic, and societal benefits. So what we're going to do is, I'm the chair and one of the co-directors. I'm Beth Scott, a professor of marine ecology at the University of Aberdeen and the environmental champion within Supergen. And we're going to have panel members here, Zoe Barnes, Professor Mark Inhall, Dr. Mark Blair, and Professor Jonathan Sharples, and they're all going to introduce themselves in just a minute. So we're just going to give you a tiny bit of background about what has happened in Supergen so far, trying to take a whole systems approach. In fact, having myself as an ecologist on the SRC grant was sort of the first step in the first Supergen, and has continued on, I'm very happy to say. So some of the things that we have done are then working with Henry Jeffries, who you heard this morning. In the first phase of Supergen, we really tried to set out a framework of using natural capital, so again, a financial way of looking at things, and trying to bring in the ecosystem effects alongside of energy developments. And we've continued on then and tried to produce, that's the Progress in Energy paper. Then we've looking at cumulative effects, really trying to show all of the range of effects and looking at cumulative effects across all the policies. How do you put policies together? So this has been work by Morgane de Clercq. And then working with Ørsted, who gave us some funding to look at the whole ecosystem approach, we tried then to put together a paper, and this is the one in ICE's journal, where we really set out the paradigm shift. How do we actually work at ecosystem level and look at all of the types of interactions we have, and what are the types of kit that we should put out there to do this, to speed things up. So hopefully you might get interested in that. And then finally what we have is that we put out a policy piece in Ecological Solutions and Evidence, where we show the evidence of what we've done with ecosystem modeling. And how we can use ecosystem modeling to go all the way to outputs for society and for finance in the terms of natural capital. And a lot of this information also went through into the European Offshore Renewable Energy Report that hopefully has influenced a lot in some of the European calls. So that's what we have been doing. But what we are going to do today then is we're going to have a discussion about how actually to do this. And so what I'm going to do now is pass over to the panel, and we're going to start with Zoe. And over to you, Zoe.
Hi,
Oh, is that
working?
Try again.
Hello?
Yes.
Just take a minute. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Hi, my name's Zoe Barnes. I wear a few hats in the offshore wind industry, particularly around the socio-economic side. So my day job is with Everose. I'm currently working with the GBE team really closely on their deep water programs. I'm a non-exec director on the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership, which is the industry body set up under the sector deal to deliver the industrial growth plan from the industry side. I'm a non-exec on the NCC, National Composite Centre, which I hope some of you might know, down in Bristol. And I co-chair what's called FlowX, which is the UK industry government body set up to accelerate the floating renewables deep wind sector in the UK. So the question was posed to us, how is addressing climate and biodiversity challenges achieve environmental, economic and social benefits? Sum up in 3 minutes, which was a bit of a challenge because it's not a simple question at all. So I just wanted to kind of revert back to my area where I work most around the socio-economic side. And I spend most of my time looking at how we can develop interventions in the public and the private sector to maximise economic benefit and societal benefit from offshore wind. In my 3 minutes, just wanted to make 2 points on it really. And the first one is, socio-economic benefit is not a nice to have, it's a need to have. It buys us our permission to operate, it buys us our long-term support. And it's going to become particularly critical in the next few years for 2 reasons. Firstly, the political moves, sadly, trend is away from deployment of offshore wind for net zero. I'm not saying it's still not important, but it's coming down the lower down the agenda. I put the 4 kind of drivers for kind of political and social permission to operate for offshore wind up there, and we see this trend towards net zero not being such a strong driver as it was. We know that energy security is coming up at the moment, and that's positive. And we know the cost of energy has always been at the top of everyone's agenda and stays at the top of everybody's agenda. But with the net zero transition coming down, we need to make sure the socioeconomic side, we can tell a good story. We can make the socioeconomic side happen in order to get our support for the industry. The second point is we're as in the UK particularly, and in other markets following behind, we're moving into deeper waters with our offshore wind, and you've seen that through these research programmes. Still referring to floating wind, we refer to deep water wind. If you haven't seen the hybrid solutions that are emerging, it's worth having a look at those. It's likely the next auction round will change away from floating towards deep water wind to allow a wider range of technologies. But in order to make that move, we need an investment, particularly from the government, of potentially billions. And to get that investment, we need to show their return on investment in terms of economic benefit to the UK and making sure that there's a clear return, financial return to the UK from those if we want to maintain, if we want to get that investment into the deep water sector. The second point I just wanted to make was there's always a balance to be made between cost, societal benefit, economic benefit, environmental benefit. That balance doesn't find itself by default, in my experience. I've been in the sector 20 years. It doesn't happen by default. It is completely driven by policy. It is completely driven by decision making. It's completely driven by where money is put and funding is put. So if we want to make it a coherent strategy on this, we need to be coherent across all the stakeholders to understand where we're going to put that money, where we're going to make those decisions, and where our drivers are coming from. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks. So yeah, my name is Mark Gill. I'm a Professor of Physical Oceanography at SANS in the west coast of Scotland. I'm also CSA, Chief Scientific Advisor Marine to the Scottish Government. That's a seconded role, so I'm independent of government. And for those of you who don't know what CSAs do generally, most UK government departments, all government departments, have Chief Scientific Advisors. And was seconded in from academia, and they're kind of a dual function of advice, recommendations, maintaining an overview of what the research interests are of their department, but also and making recommendations on those bases, but also challenging and making sure that best scientific evidence is used in policy framing and decision making, particularly in the writing of policy that if it is said to be based on scientific evidence, it's challenging that is the case, and particularly around uncertainty. In terms of offshore wind, I mean, it's clearly there are lots of issues around reserved and devolved matters for governments to grapple with, and the Scottish Government has the consenting for offshore wind in Scottish territorial water, or Scottish waters, part of UK territorial waters, which is 63% of the total areas of UK territorial waters are in Scottish jurisdiction. And some of the things that we haven't talked about, what I've shown on the figure there, are the things on the left, which are existing policy drivers around climate change, biodiversity, our targets and commitments on biodiversity targets, our targets and commitments on the good environmental status of the marine environment, which is set in law and statute across the whole of the UK in the UK Marine Strategy, and how those interact and how the scientific interacts with the process of moving through consenting for offshore wind. And what the diagram I've shown with the bright yellow arrows are supposedly showing where scientific evidence drops into the process, going from through the consenting process, finally at the end to the ministerial decision, which is who holds the risk. The risk on the decisions of consenting on offshore development ultimately are ministerial decisions, and ultimately the risk is held there. And trying to explain the relative risks under a whole host of different legislations is vital, and it has to be done through the policy space. And what we haven't heard much about, as Beth pointed out, and I understand that this audience, it's a very strong focus on build, development, supply chain, engineering, and that's exactly SRC, Supergen, but there is this host of statutory policy frameworks around environmental status. And my kind of feeling is, I'm sort of straying off the question, but my feeling is that we don't take a sufficiently holistic approach to developing whole systems and thinking about how that fits in with our existing environmental and policy constraints. So I'm very glad this session's going, and thank you for inviting me to participate in it.
Thank you, Mark. And then we have Mike.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Mike Blair. I'm the Principal Engineering Manager at the Crown Estate. My colleague Jeremy said a little bit about the Crown Estate earlier, but I'll refresh it. So the Crown Estate is an independent business which is accountable to the UK Parliament, so we sit between government and industry. We're responsible for, amongst a bunch of things, spatial planning for offshore wind and other sectors. And we've recently announced our intention to launch round 6, so that's going to be 6 gigawatts of new offshore wind capacity off the northeast of England. Through that process of coming up with a leasing round, and specifically the spatial design, we seek to take a whole systems approach. We seek to balance economic, environmental and societal value. And actually, the planning for things like round 6 comes under this wider framework, or this wider strategic plan called the Marine Delivery Route Map, which is our plan for 2050, looking at all of the sectors, offshore wind, tidal stream, and other non-energy sectors, looking at how much of the seabed they will need to take up by 2050, how they will all fit together in the most efficient way possible. And to do all of that, we invest in data and research, and we support terrific organisations like Supergen. So we do seek to take a whole systems approach, and I've listed out a bunch of examples of that. We also acknowledge the need to take even more of a whole system approach, and we're on a journey with that. Some of the examples then would be the Marine Delivery Route Map. The essence of that is about looking at the seabed and all the usage of the seabed as a system and trying to deconflict where there are conflicts. And then under that, we have various other examples. We work with NESO, the National Energy System Operator, looking at supporting their strategic spatial energy plan. And for those who don't know, NESO are currently looking at dividing the UK up into various onshore and offshore regions, and then saying how much of each generation technology there should be in each region. And we're working closely with them to make sure that our leasing plans for the seabed are coherent with that. We also, when we bring a leasing round to market, we do a plan level habitat regulations assessment as part of bringing the capacity forward. And as part, when we're doing that, we're looking at the environmental interactions of offshore wind with ecology and with the environment, and we're making sure we don't bring forward any sites that have got a very high risk of not achieving planning permission. And then, taking the whole systems thing a little bit wider, we look at life cycle impact. So, as well as trying to reduce the cost of energy through our spatial design, so pounds per megawatt hour, we're also looking at life cycle assessment for how can we reduce the kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour associated with embodied carbon in the fabrication and operation of future wind farms. How can we minimise that through spatial design by picking sites which are more conducive to good outcomes in that respect. And then finally, we think about things like safety. So as we go further offshore into more onerous metocean conditions, deeper waters, etc., we're not just choosing sites that will have more technical risks for deployment and more greater costs than ever before, but also essentially making decisions that will result in people working in more hazardous environments. And that's something we seek to take into account. And then finally, we think about innovation. So thinking about the system as we step through leasing rounds and towards 2050, how do we make sure that the next leasing round facilitates innovations in technology and other respects that feed into successful deployment of subsequent leasing rounds? I'll pass on there.
Thank you.
Thank you, and Jonathan?
Hi, Jonathan Shuttles. I'm an oceanographer at the University of Liverpool. Just at lunchtime, Beth threatened to introduce me as an ecologist. I wasn't quite sure how I felt about that. So I'm a physical oceanographer originally, but I very much sit on the boundary now between the ocean's physics and how that controls where and how fast plankton can grow, and then ultimately how the plankton are either feeding in through to food chains and commercial fisheries or feeding into how Earth's climate works. So my reason for being here is that I lead the eSuites project, which is a NERC-funded project focused on the oceanographic effects that a floating offshore wind farm might have. And you can see there the picture of the field work. We had about 5 weeks at sea last summer. That's the Bangor University Prince Maddock operating close to one of the wind turbines at the Kincardine floating offshore wind farm. And I was on Discovery, the larger ship, doing the sort of biogeochemistry and the physics measurements around the wind farm. So the question we were asking was, well, why we're interested in these is floating offshore wind farms are in deeper water. Deeper water is very different oceanographically than the shallow waters that most monopile standard wind farms are currently in. Deeper water stratifies in the summer, so you get the development of a warm surface layer on top of the cold water underneath, and that stratification is fundamental to how the basic biology of these systems works. So in summer, that structure there reaches down about 18 metres in the water, so it goes through the warm surface layer, and it's just the base of that wind turbine is just getting into the colder, deeper water, which has lots of nutrients in it. All the plankton on the surface are not doing a great deal at the moment because they've run out of nutrients, so if you can inject some turbulence in the water, for instance by the tide, sloshing backwards and forwards past this structure, you can potentially mix nutrients from the deep water up into the surface and fuel extra plankton growth. So that was the question we wanted to address. We think we've answered it. Averaged over a couple of spring neap tidal cycles, so averaged over a month. We reckon that averaged across the swath of water that's going through that whole wind farm, there's about a 17% increase in the production of the plankton, and that's ultimately going to feed on through to the rest of the food chain. So what we're working on now is that 17% increase sustained, or is it just something that you would see at the start of a wind farm? What happens as the climate warms up and the stratification gets stronger? What happens if you change the design of your wind turbine, so you either increase or decrease the drag on the flow? So we've got the observations to help the modelling, and the modelling is going to take us through to address all these other questions over the next year or two.
Okay, thank you. So, what we're going to move on to, like the last panel session, I'll leave this up for a minute so people can get their Slidos out. And so we'd like you guys to be thinking of questions. And as you've heard, we're on one major question about the whole system approach that I'll show you in a second, but I'll just see that everyone has got their cameras down now and the Slido is done. Okay, so as you've heard, one of the main questions I'd ask the panel to consider, when to think here as a set question, is all the way through the system. So consenting and design, which I think where Zoe is answering that we've got to do it at the beginning. This has to be baked in to the process to get the operational win. But are we ever getting to the whole system approach? Because I'm talking here about maximizing, although I'm thinking the panel is going to give me some feedback about optimizing rather than maximizing. But how do we either maximize, optimize environmental, economic, and social benefits? You know, we heard a bit about social benefits this morning, but we've heard the vast majority about economic benefits. Totally understandable. That's the policy of the government for growth. But we really need to see, can we be thinking about this? And I've purposely put environmental there first. Okay, so I'm going to come back to the panel to dig more into that question if you want to. Because really, again, I think, Zoe, you started pointing out the difference between deep water or floating wind and the supply chain issue. All of these things are connected, and if we're going to push, as we should, as Henry has said, into the disruptive approach where we start creating our own supply chains here in the UK with the total change in the way the world is going, how does that affect the environment as well? And not just through carbon. I think we heard one of the talks earlier before lunch, that there was pushback because of carbon. Well, there's so many other things, as Jonathan has just implemented here, that actually the wind farms are going to change plankton. And a lot of my own research has been focusing on that. So I'll put it back to the panel. We've got deeper points. Whoever wants to start, go ahead. Or what do you want to do?
So it's the current system set up. Well, it's easy for me to talk about spatial design part of the process, and if you simplify it into spatial design through to consenting, through to CFD and projects getting subsidy. I think there are elements of the spatial design part of it where a whole system approach is being taken, but there's a lot of siloed thinking going on. So if we do break it down into environmental and economic and societal benefits, I think Crown Estate can have a good stab at saying where wind farms ought to go in future in order to maximise economic benefits, and that's to put them in the bits of seabed that are close to shore and shallow water where there's good wind resource. And of course that has important negative impacts on environmental benefits, because that's where we know that birth density is highest and other important environmental impacts taken into account. And we could also have a go at saying where is best from a societal point of view. One argument on that might be to locate wind farms so that the onshore activities occur in areas of greatest deprivation where economic stimulus is most needed. But that might, again, not lead to outcomes that are low cost. And therefore, it's about the trade-offs, and it's about coming up with models. And I don't think, I was actually talking to someone about this just before lunch. There's interesting stuff going on in the academic space, and there's certainly scope for us to consider better ways to trade off these three sources of value against each other and start trying to optimise towards maximising value overall instead of trying to maximise these three things individually.
I'd say many of the similar things actually. I think there are positives in the strategic planning nature that the Crown Estate Scotland take, and we're moving towards strategic compensation in the consenting and the environmental impact space. But it's very kind of additive. It's not looking as a kind of the whole system at the same time and optimising. And I think Jonathan's point about fixed, the shallow water installations are fixed and quite mature now, and we have an opportunity with floating wind to optimise for all three of economic and social and environmental benefits, rather than try to. At the minute, it seems to me a lot of things work in parallel and maybe brought together towards the end. But they're and kind of either minimising risk or maximising benefit in one area, rather than trying to optimise for what's the optimal layout for minimal environmental impact, taking into account what we have legislated for in terms of the status of the marine environment and our biodiversity targets, but also maximising energy capture return. So I think we're kind of thinking about it. There are some elements that work well, but we don't have an overall kind of view and operate that.
I've spent quite a lot of time working developers who developing their social and environmental and economic development programs. And it's all about frameworks. It's all about what you need to do externally to drive changes in the behaviours of the developers, because ultimately we realise the benefits to the environmental, economic, social, societal benefits by changing behaviours in the developers. And there are really kind of 5 points where we can apply pressure to the developers. First one's leasing, second one's consenting, third one's CFD, and then the softer ones around pressure from the things like the Offshore Wind Industry Council, the kind of more political, reputational ones, and then through spending money through investment. And to my mind, the most important point on that is actually the leasing. The leasing is the point where we can drive any of these changes we want if we get within the constraints that are put on the Crown Estate. But that's the point at which there's least, you're writing a bid at that point, you're not actually dealing with investors, you've got less, to be honest, less scrutiny on what you're putting into the bids, but the commitments are being made. So actually, if we want a system that maximises these, I think it needs to be driven by conditions within the leasing round. And we were just talking beforehand, I helped write these, the Dutch government, when they lease sites, fairly fix the price, and they say, okay, this is the price boundaries which you need to work, but we're going to choose who gets the site based on factors that are important to us. So the one I was working was ecological innovation. They had one on alternative offtake innovation, but they say, okay, let's fix the price, let's keep the price fairly standard, you're on a level playing field now. Now, these are the bits we want you to prove you're working on. And it was enormously effective. The developer I was working with put together a £72 million programme for ecological innovation around a single wind farm. That's unheard of in this country, because we're not driving those behaviours. There were some changes in complexity leasing, I know, to include supply chain, but not on the scale that we're seeing in say, in the Dutch market. Whether the Dutch market is successful, that's another debate entirely. But actually, that to me is the point where developers have the biggest freedom, and there's the tightest competition that's not based on cost, where they can actually make those decisions and actually prioritise those. If it's part of a competition leasing requirements, it's simply a point on the budget, you just get on with it and there's no debate. If it comes further down the line, it's much increasingly hard to make justification for committing to those things.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Jonathan, do you have anything?
Yeah, I've got a listen to. So I've been on quite a steep learning curve over the past 2 or 3 months at various Supergen workshops, just trying to work out what the consenting process is. And it turns out, naively, I was expecting it to be simpler than it is. It seems to be tremendously complicated. I mean, Zoe mentions the example in the Netherlands, and that keeps popping up as a really good way of doing it. So I presume that's the case. I don't know. I guess so I'm really interested in the idea that if you're taking a whole system approach, I mean, I'm thinking about a whole oceanographic system. I don't know anything about the economics and the supply chains. A whole system approach would start off from where I was talking about. Start off from what does the water column look like? How does the primary part of the ecosystem that supports absolutely everything else, how is that going to respond to sticking that structure in the water? At the moment, I find it quite surprising that all of the effort, the consenting, the ecological sort of side of the consenting process is utterly focused on cetaceans, seals and seabirds, and not looking at the underpinning processes that are driving all that. The ocean is kind of looked at as this kind of passive bath of water, rather than actually it's a really complex, dynamic environment. And you've got to, I think sometimes that the ecological consenting almost looks at it almost from a terrestrial ecology point of view, and not thinking about the ocean it's 1,000 times denser than air, and the physics of that fluid fundamentally controls how the rest of the system could work. So actually starting off there, understanding how these structures affect that system would be a good way for me. And I think, as I always said, I think the leasing would be a really good time to get into that for whoever the Crown Estate, or whoever to say, these are the things we want you to observe, these are the things we want you to monitor as part of your development of this area.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to switch. We have a second shorter question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, and we'll just go through this question a little bit more briefly. So we've heard some examples actually already, and basically I'm asking the panel if they could change just one thing that would enable this to be a successful whole systems approach, and what would that be and why? And with Jonathan's prompting there, I'm just going to throw in the one. So far, I have not met an oceanographer or someone who understands the pelagic environment as a background in any of the policy groups I work with, the SNCBs in both Nature Scott, Natural England, in the MMO, and in DIFRA. So our big policy groups don't have oceanographers, which is potentially why that's an issue. But then over to you guys.
So, okay, I'll disagree slightly in the Scottish context, but which you're very familiar with. But I take the sentiment, definitely.
There are oceanographers in the Scottish Government. Absolutely.
One thing I think, and I agree about at the consent. I think we're all sort of saying at the consenting, at the leasing level. I mean, the one thing would be to create some sort of statutory system level offshore renewable energy regulating function that has the power to say the consented ground should have in it, not consenting, leasing, should have in it a more holistic approach to the living system in which we're industrialising. It basically saying we are going to put how many gigawatts you want to say, is it 40, 80, 100, whatever, we're going to put that many gigawatts in. There will be physical structures in the marine environment, it will have an effect. What's the optimal way to do it? Rather than minimising risk or maximising return or saying, we'll let this one go through, but that one won't, or this one came in first, so let's consider that one, but it's right next to the gamma colony. So it's like, what's the best overall system design? And I think that probably needs something statutory. So when we say, what can be done, I think we need to put pressure on governments to bring in a statutory body that has an oversight which includes the whole system, the living system into which we're putting these structures. And we will do it, it is going to happen. So that's my one thing. Maybe that was a bit long, one thing.
No, that's a good one. Thank you.
He's got a one
So
thing.
that's good.
So he's got one.
My one thing was roughly the same, actually.
Okay.
I think one body who can understand the interactions between the leasing rounds, the government targets, the consenting process, and actually we are disjointed at the moment. I think it's getting better. Certainly on the economic development side, it's getting better. I'm seeing many more conversations happening between all the funding bodies and the start of mapping from of the industrial plan and aligning around industrial plans, the start of aligning the full innovation systems for some of our changes we needed, like deep water wind. But they're still disconnected from consenting, and they're still disconnected from overall targets, and still disconnected from say, leasing plans. And I think we're getting better, but I think somewhere a body that has an ultimate target and then is working towards it would be really, really useful.
So I'll respond to that saying, Crown Estate tried as far as we were able, given our remit, to be that body, and my colleagues in the strategic consent team in Crown Estate spend so much time talking to Natural England, talking to SNCBs, making sure we understand exactly these issues, the newer one and the more established ones, and feeding through into an evidence base that informs both the spatial design, because there's two aspects to it. What do we centrally plan, which is Crown Estate directly saying these are where the wind farms are going to be, and then, as you pointed out, so there's also what do we require from the developers to take on those lease areas, and what minimum requirements do we set. So that door is open, to those conversations. Coming on to my one thing, I'm interested to ask fellow panelists, so Jonathan and Mark, how often do you guys have conversations with engineers about engineering solutions? Because it strikes me, coming back to my point around these three value streams being siloed, that we spend a lot of time understanding ever more complicated and precise ways to measure environmental impacts, probably proportionally, could be wrong, not as much time cross-disciplinary working around what could the potential mitigations be, and there are doubtless engineering mitigations. So that would be my one thing, is to have more cross-disciplinary academic and industry initiatives and forums where we can find solutions to these kinds of things.
That's kind of where Supergen comes in, isn't it? So I in the past, fairly recent past, I very rarely talk to engineers about these issues, but actually at a couple of Supergen workshops recently, I've been learning a lot about the engineering. Engineers are listening to what we found out and saying, what if we increase the drag on these structures, because then we can increase the mixing and make it even better for the plankton. And I said, no, just hold on a second, we don't quite know enough yet. Or some of the acoustics, some of the noise problems, about the idea of going to tighter tethers on the on the structures rather than the slack chains, that sort of thing. So yeah, it is. Supergen's been really good, certainly for me recently, in learning to have these conversations with the engineers and realising that all an engineer wants is a problem that they can then go and solve, which is a bit like scientists only wants a question that we can go and answer. I think you expected us to teach a task about a word in there, Beth, and we haven't done yet, so I will do. It's this idea of maximising the three benefits. Yeah, I guess you want to optimise the three benefits, and then there's a whole load of stuff in environmental, there's a whole load of stuff in the economics, a whole load of stuff in this. I mean, you've got, looks to me like a classic AI problem, isn't it? I mean, you've got so many threads in those. How do you decide how you order them in some kind of list of this priority, which will probably be different for different environments. I have absolutely no idea how you would go about that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Okay, now prepare. I'm going to come to the audience now. We have a bunch of questions online, but like we did with the first panel, we'd like to have it interactive, actually. So get ready to put your hand up if you've got questions. And if you've got your one solution answer as well. So is there anybody that wants to go first in the audience? Here we go, over here. Oh, do we have somebody with the roving mic? I think this is the one that wasn't working before. Yeah, no, I think it might be out of battery. Maybe. Here we go. Anyway, if you've got a loud voice, just go for it.
Thanks. Back by Harvard University of Southampton. Really interesting discussion. Thanks very much for that. I'm still not convinced that you actually addressed the two questions on the board here. And I really wanted you to narrow it down. If you're going to, all these offshore wind farms and so forth are too far away, although I understand the social benefit. But what is the local benefits that we can bring in to allow growth to happen? And if we're going to go deeper water, is that benefit going to be far and far away from the local population that we need to have?
Two questions there. What benefits locally from wind farm? So in the immediate locality, it's usually the O&M. So you want an O&M base and there'll be the O&M jobs associated with it from a sort of economic point of view. The rest of these sort of UK societal economic benefits very much spread. We haven't done as well as we could on fixed wind in terms of realising local and social benefits. I think as we move to deeper wind, actually I think the opportunity for societal and economic benefits is better than fixed wind, because we're starting at scratch from a new supply chain, and we start at scratch with a different perspective. When we started out fixed wind, it was about proving the technology, getting it in water, getting the cost down, and actually there wasn't the attention on the additional benefits to the UK from those projects as there should have been. There was some requirements through CFDs and things, but they didn't have teeth, and it really wasn't the focus. We're now entering the deep water wind phase with a very close scrutiny on the benefits of the UK from it. And actually, if we look at things like helping design the GBE's programme on it, absolutely top of the list is socio-economic benefits of the UK. It sits well above it. We need to get the cost down, because actually one of the societal benefits that we're talking about here is cost of energy and cost to the consumer. So the two drivers are absolutely in all decision making is cost to the consumer and economic benefits to the UK. And I think we can achieve it from floating because we're starting from scratch right now.
I agree with that. Other benefits are other users of the sea, whose fisheries are primarily located on coastal peripheral regions, and shared use of optimised design of array layouts so that there can be multi-use. Those have social benefits in a wider sense as well.
Does the Crown Estate have, looking at local benefits, is there a task force that
So it definitely is one of the pillars of the spatial design process, and it was part of the driver for having round 5 in the Celtic Sea, was to bring those, to unlock the Celtic Sea for offshore renewables, and it hadn't been unlocked at commercial scale before. And the same logic applies in terms of round 6. But I do think there's sometimes a misunderstanding here in terms of around how previously, 20 years ago for offshore wind farm, we might have been able to say that the economic benefits would be felt by the community or the coastline nearby. But actually, as the sector's matured, most wind farms are operating now using SOVs, which may be based nearby and have some marginal economics, or may be based hundreds of kilometres away. And similarly, the construction supply lines are so complex now that trying to trace back the economic benefits to specific local communities is very, very challenging.
Interesting. Okay. Another question? Up at the back here, there, and then over there. So.
Should I just shout?
Yeah, just shout for example.
Okay, Charlotte Moss, University of Manchester. There's been a lot of talk about collaboration between academia and industry. So I'm just wondering, in reality, what would your dream team look like to be working on these wind farms?
Who wants to take that one?
Simple one. So the research crews, we need to stop using that word, it's not quite the right image, but off Scotland last summer, I was on a ship with maybe 25 scientists, but 25 oceanographers ranging from the physics through to the biology and the biogeochemistry as well. And what we really need would be to have 1 or 2 engineers involved as well, just so that we can start to make those connections between how we perceive that kind of environment and the problems that environment that we need to address in that environment, and getting the feedback from the engineers about their perception of it and what they can do with some of the issues that we come up. So actually, just expanding that multidisciplinary nature of the teams I generally work in to include engineers would be great.
So the answer I give now is different from one I would have given before I was seconded into government. So the dream team now would include people who actually write policy documents. And we've talked about technology readiness level. I think, Beth, did you do your, what was your other readiness level you were going to talk about?
Oh, the RRL, restoration.
Restoration ready. So I think it's policy readiness level. So a lot of things might be technologically ready, but are they ready to be implemented in policy, which will be risk owned by a minister who may be legally challenged from all sorts of different directions. And so to me, a team needs some people who are thinking about, is something ready for policy? And also vice versa, where there is some clear evidence that some policy steer which might lead to some statutory changes would be beneficial. For instance, probably it's great that Crown Estate and Crown Estate Scotland take a more strategic view, but can they, if cost is what drives, and ultimately doing an optimised system might cost more than a system that isn't optimised, then in the present way, the maximised systems may win out over the optimised systems. And that probably does need some statutory work. And so that's when you need greater engagement, I think, with government departments, if they're willing to engage. And I understand that's not always straightforward either.
So I think, say, the developer hat on again, I think there's a lovely solution here, and where, but honestly, by the time you get to projects, you're probably too, like a development project, you're probably too late. You're running full speed at a project, and it's quite hard to interact with the project team. But in an ideal world, I think the developers would have that strong link into those universities, so that either they knew what was coming next and they could preempt it and start to feed that into their projects that are up and coming later on in their pipeline, and or they could feed the problems they could see up and coming in their projects back into the academic community, give it a few years to solve it, so by the time it gets there, by the time that they get to the project actually applying for consent or hitting the water, then actually they've got those solutions that have come out of the academic community that they can then apply. It's typically sort of 7 to 9 years for a wind farm from start to development. So actually having links into the academic where, or as challenges arise that you can see are going to land in like 3 or 4 years' time, those questions are being fed in early in order to be solved, in order to have the solutions there to apply as you move through the development process.
Thanks. So just reflecting on the challenge, one of the challenges that I said for Crown Estate is round 6. The spatial design for round 6 is happening quite imminently, and then after that, certain outcomes are locked in, or at least operating within an envelope. But we've then got a few years of making sure that those projects that come out of round 6 stand the best possible chance of delivering a good outcome. So that's not just getting the costs down as far as possible, it's also making sure that the data and evidence that supports the consenting process is as good and is as robust as possible. So the ideal team looks like the whole sector, everyone in this room getting behind those projects and focusing on specific both engineering and consenting ecological environmental challenges and issues that those projects will face. And the supplementary challenge, as always, is just time. We're just always so up against it to make offshore wind happen faster. That's why the ideal project or the dream team is always a wee bit out of reach.
And it's not just time; it's always funding. So for those UKRI high-level people in the room, okay. So yeah, some sort of project that can bring all of us together. We like that. Is a fantastic idea. Next question.
Okay, Ian asks at Swansea. My question is, where is the boundary of your system? And as an example, Port Talbot is scheduled to be one of the big build ports for Celtic Sea, for the wind farms there. 10 miles north of Port Talbot is the village of Glencorrach, which has multiple issues around social issues, about long-term poverty, about multi-generational people without a job. It's a pretty miserable place to be. It's 10 miles from this port to solve all of our problems. So my proposition, which I'd like the panel's view on, is if we include those communities adjacent to our port within this system, right from Plankton up to that village 10 miles from the coast, does that change the answer to the question? So what's the boundary?
So, as you wrote on the social plans for one of the Celtic Sea bids a couple of years or two ago now, and actually I can speak in practical terms as a developer how we tackled it. We literally had 0.0 at our grid connection point and 0.0 at our assumed port, which was Port Talbot as our default, and then we drew rings around it that said priority 1, priority 2, priority 3, all the way stretching all the way out across the south coast. And actually, when we prioritised where we were going to invest our socio-economic programmes, it was looking at that, and there was some great stuff in the Celtic Sea a bit about ensuring needs were a primary target for our programmes around skills and socio-economic. So yes, by doing that, that village would have absolutely come out as a high priority target area. And the other thing we would always do is not assume we knew the answers already as to what needed to be done. What we'd do is work with, ensure we had a local partner who understood the socio-economic situation in the area, who could always advise on where socio-economic, the highest impact could be achieved, rather than just sitting there in London or Scotland and going, do you know what, we think that region in Wales there, that needs a new football pitch, or whatever it might be. It was much more about working with local partners to do that. But I would hope that any responsible developer would consider a village like that to be a priority.
There's an oceanographer who doesn't deal with anything more complicated than a coat pole. But I get it from a personal perspective. I guess I would feel nervous about the idea of setting a boundary where you're going to have an influence. So I would hope that, as we said, you're going to have interactions with local government, particularly, who know what's going on around there. So which places would really benefit from having some development for building infrastructure, which places would benefit from having transport links that would get them into the places where these new jobs or that kind of thing. I mean, it kind of goes back to the question earlier about how we missed off what these sort of big benefits would be. And potentially with floating offshore wind, I think we're looking at not just a big industry for developing our own floating offshore wind, it's potentially quite a big export market as well, because the UK, to some extent, we're lucky in that we've got a lot of very shallow, flat, coastal environments where we've been able to invest heavily in monopile, seabed foundation offshore wind farms. There's a lot of areas around the world which are interested in offshore wind, but have really narrow shelves and are going to have to go straight into floating. And I think we're being watched quite carefully for that. So I guess I'm drifting away from the boundaries question a little bit. What I'm saying is that the opportunities there are probably a lot broader than we sometimes think.
Excellent. Okay. There's two questions. Sorry, they're close to each other here.
Hi, how are you? Owen Ross, an independent consultant. Just a question for the panel. I just looking at this and looking at the socioeconomic challenges, we've made huge inroads in the likes of Hull and Grimsby and the north of Scotland in driving benefits at the community level, particularly, I suppose, regenerating some areas in some cases, but also keeping people in the area, particularly those remote areas. Are we missing a trick, though, when it comes to, yes, we roll out the leasing rounds, we get everything going, we get it through consent. When it's up and running and operational, are we missing that trick there then to build upon what we've already got for the area? And recognising it may be a little bit more on the environmental side, purely because you have environmental environments which are changing rapidly, and I suppose the North Sea and maybe some of the fish stocks there, the challenges around that could be something we build upon, or whether it's seaweed or it's plankton or it's fish stocks itself, and then bringing in the local communities. Where are we missing a trick once we go into the operational phase for wind farms? They seem to be a little bit left behind, or they're done with at that point. It's something I suppose just asking out loud to the panellists.
I'll latch on to the question, just around the fish, reference to fish stocks and how things change over time, because that is something that we've thought about for around 6 quite a lot in terms of the evidence base. But when you're looking at things like data pertaining to where fisheries are just now, the fisheries themselves will tell you that these things move around in annual cycles, and particularly driven by climate change, might be expected to be totally different in 20 or 40 years' time. So, and the same applies in ecology as well, as far as I understand, definitely in terms of bird populations, mammal populations. So, we're working with an organisation that's now looking at nature refugia, so areas where there might be a certain amount, relatively low amount of ecological activity just now, but they've been identified as areas where there's likely to be greater density of ecological systems in future, and therefore good places to either target offshore wind development towards as a protective measure, or avoid in terms of certain types of development as well.
I think that's it's probably yes to our missing trick, but I'm just not sure we've got much leverage post-operation. I mean, we've run out of leverage points on developers at that point. They've got their CFD, they've got the consent, they've got their grid connection, they've got everything else. There's actually, there's no points of leverage left, unless there's a commitment made at lease, or probably at least for community funds. We've saved years, but actually, how are you going to make them change their behaviour around that? I just don't think we've got the leverage to do that at operational stage. Plus, wind farms change hands, right? As soon as they're operational, they keep changing hands. So whoever built it and made the commitments there are probably not the same people who are operating it. and actually trying to put any leverage on those developers who are acquiring wind farms is not possible.
I suppose where challenges is the policy. Should we have a little bit more a longer view on the policy to have that leverage option that we can pull those levers then? Something like that it's an ongoing, it's similar to O&M, it's an ongoing moving feast.
Yeah, I think right, and I think I'd throw decommissioning in there and making sure we had really strong position around decommissioning and picking up the consequences of decommissioning at the end as well.
Okay, so last question here, I think. Oh, well, we'll see. How quick is your question?
I'm Olga Ganova, Strasbourg University. I really like the comment that water pass water. As an engineer, maybe engineers consider it as a dead pass of water because they've given up with the idea of trying to put in a box of that living dynamic system. And they are looking at it as the most powerful input. But if we say that we've grown up enough, and do you feel we learned enough about this dynamic system to try to bring that granularity into the design from engineering side? If you feel that we are at that stage and we start doing baby steps in that direction, which parameters should come in first from this dynamic living organism, because it's changing all the time, to try to predict it, that granularity and that effect from this living, not that part water. So which one should come in first then?
Go,
So I would say, so we know how the system works. I would say pretty well now. There's a fantastic picture that I use that my PhD supervisor, John Simpson in Bangor, and a biological oceanographer Paul Tett, in the late 70s, early 80s, they were just getting a handle on how the plankton productivity in the ocean is constrained by the physics of the water column, and how the thermocline is fundamental to controlling how the nutrients get to the plankton. And they had a sketch of this contraption that they designed. They said, wouldn't it be great if we could design something that is tethered inside the thermocline, and as the tides go past it, it generates turbulence and moves nutrients up and fuels the plankton. And that's effectively what we're doing now. It was a rather prescient sort of thing. So in terms of how the system works, I think we're there. In terms of from an engineering perspective, where would I... Okay, this is me with my physicist hat on as well. I think one of the really tricky things in oceanography, and this is just coastal oceanography, it's global oceanography, is how turbulent mixing works in stratified environments. We've got various turbulent storage schemes and things like that we use in our models to try and parameterize that. But that's one of the really tricky things. It's such an important, if you even want to get the heat budget right, if you want to get the nutrients right, everything depends on how turbulent mixing responds to stratification, because stratification is so good at inhibiting the mixing. So improvements there would go a long way, because if you get that right, then you've got more confidence in the rest of the system following on from it. If you asked a different oceanography, you might get a different.
There's one here. And then we'll have to shut it down.
So, yeah, I agree with Jonathan. Actually, I'm not going to disagree. It's another oceanographer, but I think someone spoke this morning. I think it was Guy about first industrial revolution and how it did all these great things. And at that time, think about the smogs in London and all the mess that we're dealing with now, the Clyde, the heavy metals in the Clyde, all sorts of fallout from the first industrial revolution. Our understanding of the Earth's ecosystem is so utterly different than it was. And so I think then, when we just developed it, we were full steam ahead, literally. But the fact that we have these discussions now, and the fact that we are talking about strategic compensation, we're talking about optimization, we are all in the room talking together, I think that's hugely positive. So I don't know what the exact solution is, and I don't know what the best solution is, but talking and understanding that we are going to put a lot of infrastructure inside a living being, which is the ocean. I'm just so glad we are having this conversation, and I think we'll be in a better place than we would be if we one, having a conversation, but quite where we'll end up, I don't know.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I think we're going to have to end it on that, and that's a really positive note. I think you can't believe how excited I am actually hearing that stuff, and within the Supergen team that know I've been pushing for stratification for a while across the engineering and ecological communities. So please give it up for our panelists here.